Well, I don't have very much time, so I'll just go through this very briefly. And what I thought I'd do is provide some data to fill in some of the gaps that we've had so far. And we were interested in looking at the real quantitative data that supported or refuted, perhaps, the concerns that had been raised. And what we found when we did a systematic review was we found 17 studies, some of which have already been referenced, some of by the people who are on the panel. And these studies collectively showed consistent evidence that implementing trade agreements was associated with increased consumption of processed foods and sugar-sweetened beverages. Granting import licenses for patented drugs increased access to pharmaceuticals. There was some evidence associating trade agreements and the policies that go with them with cardiovascular disease and higher BMI. But there was less clear evidence about tobacco consumption, and probably not unexpectedly, little evidence to link them with under 5 mortality, maternal mortality, and life expectancy. Those studies had been done, but we wouldn't really expect them necessarily to show much of a change. What we did was to pull together a conceptual framework to help us in our research going forward, and we thought that a free trade agreement, which normally would have trade clauses, investment clauses, would lower barriers to trade, lower barriers to investment, and that would facilitate imports and investments by the food and beverage industry in particular, manufacturing and processing, changes to domestic production. And we could identify 2 mechanisms we might be able to research, but in fact 2 pathways to the same. One is an association between free trade agreements and higher caloric intake, and another is just mediated by changes in consumption. And that then set us off on a series of studies. And in one of the studies we looked at a now quite old free trade agreement, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, which is particularly interesting, although it came into force in 1989. It reduced barriers in trade and investment between the US and Canada over a 10-year period. But of course, NAFTA came in halfway through, and that changed things. But it was interesting because it was a discrete policy initiative. It wasn't part of a larger package of reforms, and it wasn't implemented in response to any other major crisis that was happening at the time. And it took place at a time that was different from other changes that had taken place in Canada. There had been other changes in canola oil production, changes to general sales taxes and so on. And it is widely seen as a blueprint for subsequent free trade agreements. But what was really interesting was that nobody was really sure that it would come into force until it actually did. It was the centerpiece of the Canadian general election in 1988, referred to as the free trade election, and that was closely contested. So it was really only whenever the election result was declared that people knew that it would come in. Now that's important for doing time series analysis, because normally with any change in policy, some people will anticipate it and begin to do things before. Some people will delay a bit, and it makes it difficult to have a timing. What we found was that it certainly did increase the food trade with Canada, both US imports from Canada, US exports to Canada. It increased investment in the food industry in Canada. But what we did that was innovative was to develop a synthetic control approach. And this is where we looked at countries that were similar to Canada in the period before the policy change came about. And we used an algorithm to identify which countries those were, and we could then use them as a control that we could project forward and see what happened to them and compare it with what happened in Canada. And when we do that, we see that there was a significant increase in calorie availability in Canada compared to what we estimate would have happened in its absence. And we can estimate that the estimated rise in caloric intake accounted for about 2/3 of the total rise in obesity in that period. We did something very similar with the NAFTA agreement, which progressively reduced tariffs on high fructose corn syrup. There had been a 5% tariff, and that was progressively reduced over 5 years from 1994. Again, we identified countries where the trends there strongly were consistent or correlated with what had happened in Canada before the policy was introduced. And in that case, it was Spain, Germany, New Zealand. And this is what we see. So the trend in Canada had been relatively flat. the synthetic control, which was what happened in the other countries not exposed to NAFTA, continued. It rose a little bit, but there was a massive increase in synthetic Canada, or in the actual Canada. So we can take it from that NAFTA seems to have been strongly associated with a marked rise in high fructose corn syrup consumption in Canada. The tariff reductions coincided with an increase in about 41 calories per capita per day. And what this shows is that even a seemingly modest change in product tariffs in free trade agreements can substantially alter population-wide dietary behaviour. And I think that the synthetic control method is an opportunity to adapt the traditional methods of time series analysis to provide some data which actually do back up many of the concerns we've heard about. Thank you.